there you go, to ask a question, please use the Q&A feature. So there's both a chat feature and a Q&A feature, and we'll be monitoring the question and answer feature. And you can access that by moving your cursor to the bottom of the screen, and a toolbar should pop up, and you should see Q&A. And so if you hit that right now, you'll be able to write questions and answers in there. And so we'll be answering those throughout the presentation. If you are a registered dietitian and would like to count this event towards your continuing education hours, we will be providing a certificate of attendance that you can use for that purpose. We will mail that certificate to all attendees who provided their email during the registration, along with a copy of the slides used during the presentation. So without further ado, let me introduce our speakers. So our first speaker is Dr. Christine Momente. Dr. Momente is a cancer epidemiologist, clinical researcher, and a registered dietitian who's focused on the primary and secondary prevention of colorectal cancer through diet and lifestyle, as well as screening and early detection. She received her BS in Human Nutrition from Ohio State and a Master of Public Health and Nutrition from the University of Minnesota. She's completed a postdoctoral fellowship in cancer epidemiology at Columbia University, Mailman School of Public Health, and an NIH fellowship in patient-oriented research at the Ohio State University Comprehensive Cancer Center. Over the past 15 years, she's conducted dietary-based cancer chemoprevention clinical trials and epidemiologic pooling studies specifically focused on colorectal cancer, colorectal polyps and adenomas, and risk factors related to the occurrence and recurrence of digestive tract cancers. She's also worked with public in nutrition education and cancer prevention, and has provided clinical guidance to individuals on weight loss and cancer survivorship. Dr. Momente works closely with the American Institute for Cancer Research, who is kind of a co-sponsor of this event. She serves as a science analyst for AICR. She's also the chair of the National Colorectal Cancer Roundtable Advanced Adenoma Working Group, co-chair of the Colorectal Cancer Alliance Peer Review Grants Program, and a member of the Colorectal Cancer Alliance Medical Scientific Advisory Committee. So that's Christine. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about Alice. Alice Bender translates the science of cancer prevention into practical advice for consumers and healthcare professionals, which I think is great. As AICR's Senior Director of Nutrition Programs and spokesperson, she keeps the public informed on cancer preventive lifestyle choices through AICR's education programs, and she's going to talk about some of those today. She also has media appearances and online communications. Ms. Bender leads several programs designed for individuals to lower their cancer risk and improve overall health through healthful eating and moving more. These include AICR's New American Plate Challenge and AICR's I Thrive Plan, which she'll talk about more today too. She works with healthcare providers, offering research updates, educational materials, and programs to help patients and clients lower their cancer risk. She joined AICR in 2009. Prior to that, she provided clinical and health promotion services at Stanford University and the University of Georgia. She also has a master's degree in nutrition and public health from Columbia University Teachers College. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Christine and let her get started.
Thank you very much, Carlin. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Very happy to be here and co-presenting with Alice Bender. So let's just get started. I wanted to provide a little background on colorectal cancer, just in terms of its incidence and mortality. Oops. Well, first, let me just back up and go through a few of the learning objectives. So after reviewing our presentation today, all the participants should be able to describe the burden of colorectal cancer and the key risk factors, understand the dietary factors that influence colorectal cancer risk, learn about the latest AICR third expert report, which provides a strong foundation for the current recommendations on eating patterns and physical activity to reduce overall cancer risk. Should be able to list lifestyle factors that increase or decrease risk for colorectal cancer, based on the latest Colorectal Cancer Continuous Update Project, the CUP report, also created by the AICR, translate nutrition and physical recommendations for reduced cancer risk into practical steps for public health messages and individual actions. So we're hoping there's a lot of action items people can take away today, and then be able to create a list of reliable cancer-related resources on diet, weight, and physical activity for professional use and for the general public. So just as a brief outline of what we plan to discuss, as I mentioned, I wanted to cover a little bit of the burden of disease, talk a little bit about the dietary lifestyle factors, some work that I've been involved with over the years, and then talk about the AICR recommendations and tools and resources. So one of the reasons I've been studying colorectal cancer for so long and find it so interesting is the fact that it is the second leading cause of cancer-related death. It's only second to a couple other cancers that I'm going to show you in the next few slides. It's more than 60% are found in the regional or distant stage, meaning that they're a little far along in terms of prognosis and survival, which really is dramatically reduced at those stages. The majority of colorectal cancer is sporadic, so this is where we have a big opportunity for prevention. And the other reason that colorectal cancer is such an important topic is that it is the second leading cause of cancer-related death, but it is one of the most preventable cancers. And so when we look at incidence, and just thinking about by the end of today, about 375 new cases of colorectal cancer will be diagnosed today. And it's third in incidence, meaning it's the third most common cancer that's diagnosed. And when we look at mortality, it is the second leading cause of cancer-related death when you combine males and females together. And so when we think about mortality, by the end of today, about 140 people will die of colorectal cancer today. And this happens every day of the year. So this is a big problem. And if you see, especially on this mortality figure, pancreas cancer is not too far behind colon cancer. This is really unfortunate because colon cancer is so preventable. Pancreas, we can't say the same. And we really have a big opportunity to impact colon cancer for that reason, colorectal cancer for that reason. Just in general, over the last several years, colorectal cancer incidence and mortality has actually been declining. We've seen significant reductions just in the last decade or so by about 30%, predominantly due to increased screening, more people getting colonoscopies and other stool-based testing, in addition to better technology in terms of being able to find polyps more easily and detect cancers early. When we look at the comparison group, or look at the comparison of age groups, we know that the over 50 population specifically is declining, but when we stratify by this younger group under 49, we actually see an increasing incidence in the 0 to 49-year-old age group. And this has been significant. We've seen almost a 70% increase since 1974 in young onset colorectal cancer. New cases by age group. So when we talk about sort of, who's getting this disease, and as epidemiologists, that's one of the clues that we try and understand is who's getting the disease, what age are they, where are these people located, and try to come up with some ways that we can design interventions. So the majority of colorectal cancer is really diagnosed in these later years. The mean diagnosis is 68 years of age among men and 72 in women. So it is something that occurs over time. A person who is age 50 has about a 5% lifetime risk of being diagnosed with colorectal cancer and about a 2.5% chance of dying from the disease. And colorectal cancer represents 8% of all new cancer cases in the United States. So it's a pretty good proportion of cases that, again, we have the opportunity to prevent. When we look at the breakdown of colorectal cancer, like I said, the majority are sporadic. That's on the left in blue, that big piece of the pie. But then there are about 2 to 5% of all colorectal cancers that arise from a well-defined inherited syndrome. This includes familial adenomatous polyposis, Lynch syndrome, and other familial syndromes. And then there's about a third that have some kind of familial risk, meaning they have a parent, a sibling, a child, in some cases second-degree relatives, grandparents, aunts, etc., who've had colorectal cancer. And so that whole group is about 30%, but really the majority of colorectal cancer really arises due to no known cause. And interestingly, when people are diagnosed with cancer, with colorectal cancer, 70% don't even present with symptoms. When we look at the 5-year survival, so if someone is diagnosed with colorectal cancer today, depending on where the tumor is located, really dictates and is a strong contributor to a person's survival of the disease. If it's found in these early localized stage, after 5 years, there's a 90% 5-year survival. However, less than 40% of cases are diagnosed in this early localized stage. And what we see is that the majority of cases, over 60% of cases, are found when the disease is in the regional and the distant stages where it's spread to other parts of the body, like metastasis, and or it's invaded the wall of the colon or rectum. And at this point, like I said here earlier, the survival is very low when you start to get into these regional and especially distant stages. So there's a big opportunity for prevention. And as Carlin mentioned, I'm very interested in the primary and secondary prevention of colorectal cancer. Primary prevention is where we talk about lifestyle, and we talk about environmental factors that we have some control over and that we can make changes in. And so a recent study found that about 52% of colorectal cancer could be prevented through lifestyle. Secondary prevention is when we talk about screening and ways of reducing risk by finding polyps and cancers early. One of the interesting features and very unique features of colorectal cancer is that we have a prime target of prevention for colorectal cancer. It is the polyp, and certain polyps are called adenomas. And colorectal cancer in general is a very slow-growing tumor. You can take from an initiated cell all the way to you see a visible growth like a polyp. It can take an estimated 15 to 25 years for that tumor to actually be visible and be evaluated. More than 95% of colorectal cancers arise from the adenomatous polyp. So this is a precursor that's very important. And as an initial mucosa that's healthy develops a few mutations or is initiated and goes from the initiation to the promotion to the progression stages to carcinoma, this develops by a progression of several different genetic alterations. And some of these alterations, such as COX-2 and other inflammatory mediators, actually drive the adenoma into the carcinoma development. And so inflammatory genes and a number of other genes are really important in how this cancer progresses. And you'll see why when we start talking about our diet, how our diet can really influence the expression of our genes and reduce our risk. So these are the established risk factors for colorectal cancer. And there are a number of factors. Like I said, there's hereditary when you have a family history. And this is FDR, first degree relative, meaning sibling, parent, child. If you have one first degree relative with colorectal cancer, your risk of colorectal cancer doubles. If you have more than one relative, it quadruples. And if you have a relative with colorectal cancer under 45, like I showed you, the incidence of this younger age group is on the rise. If you have a younger relative with colorectal cancer, your risk for colorectal cancer also quadruples. If you have certain inflammatory conditions, which are drivers of this disease, you also increase your risk. Diabetes is a big factor, and then there's a whole number of lifestyle factors related to alcohol consumption, obesity, red and processed meat, smoking, which are all factors that increase risk. Other lifestyle factors that are protective or decrease our risk have to do with physical activity, dairy and fruit consumption, vegetable consumption, and dietary fiber. So the American Institute for Cancer Research has published the Continuous Update Project, the CUP report. And Alice is going to talk a little bit more about that. But just in terms of a summary matrix of how these different modifiable risk factors are associated with colorectal cancer risk. And so here on the left, you see we have strong evidence, limited evidence, and strong evidence. And so within strong evidence, we have convincing and probable, meaning there's convincing evidence that this factor increases or decreases risk, and there's probable probable evidence that these factors increase or decrease risk. So when we look at convincing, this is very strong data that's been developed over many years, looking at thousands upon tens of thousands of peer-reviewed articles that have been evaluated by expert panels, and found that physical activity is one of the convincing factors for reducing colorectal cancer risk. And when we look at what increases risk, the convincing factors are processed meat, alcoholic drinks, body fatness and obesity, and adult attained height. When we look at the probable dietary and lifestyle constituents, we see whole grains being a probable factor in reducing our risk, foods containing fiber, dairy products, and calcium supplements. And again, red meat increases risk. So we know that red and processed meat are pretty significant factors for increasing our risk of colorectal cancer, along with alcohol, which is now is causally related to colorectal cancer. So we're going to talk a little bit more about these. So when we look at body fatness, and this is important when we are talking about dietary factors, because we know that our diet can dramatically increase our risk of obesity, overweight, and carrying excess body weight, especially in the abdominal area, which is a particular risk. And so when we look at obesity, it really is the largest avoidable non-smoking cause of cancer mortality overall. So we know that there's up to 20% of cancer deaths are attributed to obesity today. And we know that a large portion of our population is in the overweight and obese category. So this is a real opportunity for intervention and a real opportunity for colorectal cancer specifically. So we know that a higher BMI is strongly associated with colorectal cancer. When we talk about red and processed meat, so it's really important, especially for anyone that's on the call that will be educating the public, that will be trying to enforce and enact and motivate change. These are some important visuals to sort of keep in mind, because when people say, well, I do eat a little red and processed meat, you don't really know what the portion size is. And I think a lot of people don't really understand portion size. And that can be one of the best tools in terms of primary prevention of colorectal cancer. So if we think about a deck of cards and we look at a portion of steak or red meat, that's about the size of one portion. When we look at a hamburger, you could just use the inside of your palm as a guideline. And I don't know if anyone's looking at their palm now, but there's not many hamburgers you see at that size. So there's a real opportunity for education here as well. Bacon, about 3 slices of bacon is 1 serving, and 1 to 2 hot dogs if people are choosing that as one of their protein sources. And so the recommendation from the American Institute for Cancer Research is to, and it's not a recommendation to include red meat, but if you do eat red meat, to limit your consumption to less than or equal to 18 ounces per week. So each of these servings is 3 ounces. So if you think about how many times a day someone would eat meat or how many times a week, you want to keep it under 18 and avoid it when possible. And these are all the processed meats to try to avoid. And the reason that this data is so compelling is that when we look at this meta-analysis of red and processed meat and colorectal cancer risk, we see a dose-response relationship, meaning as people eat more red meat, their risk increases incrementally. And so there's a real relationship, and that's one of the criteria that we use when we're talking about causality. And one of the things we'd like to see with causality is there a dose-response relationship? As someone eats more or is exposed more to a certain item, does it incrementally increase their risk? And we do see this for red and processed meat consumption. And this is just a visual showing you how these relative risks here on the right are actually increased over 1, meaning after 1, we see an increased risk among those who consume red meat and colorectal cancer. I touched on metabolic syndrome a little bit when I talked about diabetes. And these two are a little bit linked because it's all about the metabolic dysregulation in the body and how this has a significant impact on colorectal cancer. So these are the guidelines for metabolic syndrome. There's 5 characteristics. Any person that is diagnosed with 3 out of the 5 is now in the metabolic syndrome category. And so anyone with abdominal obesity measured by waist circumference, not BMI, high triglycerides, low HDL, high blood pressure, and high fasting glucose. Any three of these will put you into the metabolic syndrome category. The interesting thing is that among all people with metabolic syndrome, colorectal cancer is the frequent cancer diagnosed in individuals with this syndrome. And so another factor to hit on, and I'm going to now get into a little more of the dietary factors that can act as nutritional armor for our DNA in many ways. And so this is a very simple diagram of our DNA. And all day long, our DNA is susceptible to a number of what are called oxidative hits. So all day long, the body and the DNA is actually vulnerable to these potential, they're called reactive oxygen species or free radicals, that can damage parts of the DNA. And like I was showing you, colorectal cancer is a very slow-growing process. So from the time the DNA is altered until you see an actual polyp can be a decade or 2 decades. And so these early alterations are very important, and they're very important to prevent. And so when we look at things in our diet that reduce oxidative stress, these are a lot of the bright-colored fruits and vegetables, whole grains, legumes, and anti-inflammatory foods and spices like turmeric, ginger, garlic, onions. All these foods act as sort of a mop to sop up those free radicals before they have an opportunity to damage the DNA. And the reason that they're so important is because they have a number of phytochemicals or plant chemicals that are concentrated within each of these foods that actually act to produce this effect. So by incorporating all these different types of foods in the body, we can actually prevent some of those early oxidative hits. In addition to that, eliminating excess sugars. And so I want to switch to whole grains because this is one of those food products that can actually help to reduce oxidative stress. And so again, here we see a dose-response meta-analysis of whole grain intake and colorectal cancer. And so again, when we look at people who are consuming whole grains, we see an incremental decrease in their risk for colorectal cancer. And here's where we see this protective effect. So in some cases, we're almost at a 25% lower risk of colorectal cancer. And in some cases, it's a little bit less. But all of these studies are actually less than 1, meaning that our relative risk for colorectal cancer when consuming 90 grams of whole grains per day is significantly reduced. And so when we talk about whole grains, I think there's a lot of misinformation in the public, and people really need to understand when you eat a whole grain, this is not just eating whole grain or whole wheat pasta or whole wheat bread, which is a source of whole wheat and whole grain, but it's often not the best source. And so when you're talking about whole grains, and especially educating the public, you want to make sure that people are eating actually all 3 parts of the grain. The bran, which is the outer layer, which has all the fiber, the B vitamins, the phytochemicals. This is the real key part here, which is actually one of those constituents that can sop up the free radicals. You want to make sure you have the germ intact, which are the B vitamins, again, phytochemicals and other trace minerals and vitamin E. And then this inner layer is all the carbohydrates and protein. And so what happens is when we eat refined grains, it actually removes 25% of the protein and 50 to 70% of the nutrients. And this happens because a refined grain is really just this inner layer. When a grain is refined, the bran is removed, the germ is removed, and what we're left is this starchy carbohydrate center, which doesn't provide all the vitamins, all the nutrients, all the phytochemicals that the body needs to protect itself from colorectal cancer. And so these are just strong evidence from the Continuous Update Project from AICR that whole grains help protect against colorectal cancer. They're nutrient dense. Non-starchy vegetables and fruit help protect against all aerodigestive cancers, meaning from the esophagus all the way down through the colon and rectum. And then dietary fiber helps protect against colorectal cancer. And indirectly, you get effects on weight gain, overweight, and obesity. A person feels fuller longer, and they tend not to eat as much. So these are just some other good sources of fiber to include in your diet. And then when we talk about the anti-inflammatory sort of variety in the foods that we incorporate into our diet, these are all probably very familiar terms to everyone. These are foods that we all eat that are very abundant in the atypical diet. But then when we look at these foods and then look here at their chemical names, you'll see that it changes a little bit. So broccoli, main constituent is sulforaphane. Lycopene in tomatoes is one of the key constituents in tomatoes, which is more prominent when tomatoes are cooked. Olives, which are a big source of polyphenols. Berries, which blueberries as an example, are a good source of anthocyanins, which give the berries that dark purple color. And so I just wanted to quickly, we don't have much time left, but I just wanted to go quickly through a few studies that I've been involved in, specifically looking at foods in colorectal cancer that are highly concentrated in polyphenolic compounds. And one of these are black raspberries. And so this picture here is a picture of a black raspberry, which is right here in the middle. It looks just like a red raspberry, but it's black. It's not a black berry, which has a different center. These have identical features of the red raspberry, but they're black. And here's a picture of the black raspberries that were freshly picked. And the work that I conducted with black raspberries was actually with Dr. Gary Stoner, who is one of the pioneers in black raspberry research in colorectal cancer and esophageal cancer work. And so I just wanted to run through a few studies that were conducted in his lab that were significant for colorectal cancer. And so the berries that were used in all our cancer research studies were grown on a farm in Wilmington, Ohio. All the studies were conducted at the Comprehensive Cancer Center at The Ohio State University. And this is Stokes Raspberry Farm, which was just about 30 or so miles south of Columbus, Ohio. And the black raspberries were grown on this farm, and there was a dedicated space on the farm for growing berries just for cancer research. And so the reason that the black raspberries were so attractive as a preventive agent is because they have so many antioxidant qualities. And these polyphenols, which is one of the key constituents in black raspberries, are actually abundant in other things in our diet. Tea, dark chocolate, legumes, apples, grains, soy, onions, citrus fruit, coffee. All these things contain these polyphenols, which are very effective oxidative or free radical absorptors, and can actually have a significant effect on keeping our DNA protected from some of those oxidative hits. And one of the reasons that we use the whole berry in the research is because when you try and isolate, if you think, well, geez, it looks like one of the most significant factors in the berry might be the beta carotene or the vitamin A, to extract that particular component and expect it to work in isolation has proven that does not work. And so what you need is actually the synergy of all these minerals, fiber, phytosterols, carotenoids, vitamins, etc. These all work together to produce the effect. And that's one of the reasons why supplements aren't always the best choice, because you're not getting the synergy that actually helps the food product to do its job. And so this field called cancer chemoprevention is one that seeks to prevent, inhibit, or reverse the carcinogenesis process by identifying and intervening with synthetic or naturally occurring entities found in the diet or environment. And Dr. Stoner really is the person that really emphasized this natural occurring, these dietary constituents that might help us really preserve the integrity of this normal cell from going onto a cancer cell. And that is done through these plant-based chemopreventive agents such as berries, lifestyle interventions, and then these are the synthetic drugs that also work. But really, these lifestyle plant-based interventions are really the best approach in many cases. And so this is just a little bit about how these food products work in terms of preventing cancer. So we have cancer blocking agents. So here's our normal cell here. And from a time that a normal cell has some kind of interaction with a carcinogen, think about tobacco smoke. There's over 200 carcinogens in tobacco smoke, mainly in the form of benzoate pyrene. When you incorporate these cancer blocking agents, if you remember, we looked at ellagic acid, which is in berries, indole 3-carbinol, which are in the cruciferous vegetables, sulforaphane in broccoli, flavonoids in all these polyphenol-rich foods, they can actually help to detoxify that carcinogen, preventing it from causing damage to the DNA in this normal cell. The other way that these foods work is that they act as suppressing agents. So say you have your normal cell, now there was some kind of oxidative hit, some reactive oxygen species that somehow altered the DNA, and now you have an initiated cell, and that cell can be promoted, meaning it may proliferate, it will divide, it will divide and expand over the years, and eventually pop up as a pre-neoplastic set of cells like a polyp in the colon. And what these cancer suppressant agents do is that they actually prevent those pre-neoplastic cells from going on to a carcinoma. And some of these may be familiar because these were in the list of the foods I showed earlier. Beta-carotene, curcumin is one of the anti-inflammatory spices, EGCG and tea, genistein in soy, resveratrol, gingerol, capsaicin in peppers. So these are just ways that you wonder why, we talk about diet being so important, and you can see why these phytochemicals can really produce a significant effect. And again, when we talk about this prime target for prevention, this is where the diet can really intervene in preventing not only this initiation of a cell through that detoxification process, or preventing these neoplastic cells that have already started to develop from going further on to a carcinoma. And so these are just a couple pictures of polyps and the prevalence of these adenomas. And about 20 to 60% of adults over 50 will develop a polyp in their lifetime. And 30 to 40% of people will develop a colorectal adenoma by the time they're 60. So these are pretty prevalent growths that occur in the colon. And again, if we have an opportunity from preventing that from happening in the first place, or preventing it from going on to cancer, is really important. And so these are a couple of the studies we did with the black raspberries. This is black raspberry powder. We first tested it in a pharmacokinetic study to make sure it was safe, that it could be absorbed, and found that it was a really good way to for a person to incorporate a large dose of polyphenols. This was about a pound of black raspberries, which once it was pulverized to a fine powder, it was a very small amount that people actually had to consume in the form of a slurry. This is the powder mixed with water. So these are just a couple of the studies that were conducted in our colorectal cancer patients. So once patients were diagnosed with colorectal cancer, we enrolled them in our study if they agreed, and we fed them a regimen of black raspberry powder over a course of either 1 to 9 weeks. It was just taking the time between their initial diagnosis and surgery and providing an intervention. And so we took biopsies at baseline, biopsies at surgery, pre and post intervention with black raspberries, and we wanted to see if it had any effect on these specific tumor suppressor genes. And again, this is really Dr. Stoner had some very interesting hypotheses, and the black raspberries showed the ability to demethylate tumor suppressor genes, meaning allowing them to actually do their job, and modulate biomarkers of tumor development in the colon and rectum. And these are some of the markers that were investigated. We also looked specifically at a study just in terms of plasma cytokines, which are inflammatory mediators. And again, feeding a black raspberry slurry 3 times a day. And the anti-inflammatory proteins associated with controlling inflammation were increased in patients treated with black raspberry powder. So in those patients, the ability to control inflammation was actually enhanced after the intervention. And then finally, this is a study we conducted at the Cleveland Clinic with patients who had familial adenomatous polyposis. As you might remember from that pie chart in the beginning, this accounts for a very small portion of colorectal cancer, but it provides an opportunity to see if we could prevent people born with the propensity to develop thousands of polyps in their rectum, in their colon. And so their colon is removed, but there's always an opportunity for those polyps to recur in the rectum. So in this particular study, a black raspberry suppository was developed, and the black raspberry slurry was also administered in a placebo form and a berry form. This was over the course of 9 months. And when the patients took the suppository and the black raspberry slurry, they had almost a 60% reduction in polyps compared to the placebo. And they significantly reduced cellular proliferation, meaning the ability for those cells to multiply, those abnormal cells to proliferate, and then a number of genes that were associated with tumor progression. So the berries in this particular case were sort of sufficient for regressing rectal polyps. And then finally, as one last sort of litmus test, we also fed patients a very inflammatory stressor meal. And so this is a meal that was 1,300 calories, 60 grams of fat, a day's worth of sodium. And we wanted to see if we feed people this inflammatory meal, can the berries have an impact on inflammation? We know this is, like I said, when people consume this type of diet, it increases the inflammation in their body. And so what we did in this study is we fed 10 overweight and obese men the McDonald's diet on its own and took their blood for 12 hours. We then had them come back a week later, fed them the McDonald's breakfast, but this time we added the black raspberry slurry to the breakfast, and we took their blood for 12 hours. And you'll see here, this blue line is the high-fat, high-calorie meal on its own, and this is one of the key inflammatory mediators, interleukin-6. And we see a significant increase in inflammation. And then when we combined the inflammatory meal with black raspberries, we saw a significant buffering of those inflammatory mediators. So we know that even if people are going to eat high-fat, high-saturated fat, foods that promote inflammation, by incorporating some of these polyphenols, we have the ability to buffer some of those inflammatory effects. And so just as a summary, it's the synergistic effects of all these different foods that are significant in reducing colorectal cancer for all the mechanisms and the reasons I showed. And now I'm going to turn it over to Alice to talk about ways that we can really move this, bring this forward to the public, translate this science into easy and accessible ways for people to incorporate these changes in a way that's enjoyable and in a way that they're informed of how impactful this, how impactful diet and lifestyle can reduce colorectal cancer risk. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Christine. So I'm looking at the Q&A and I'm not seeing any questions. If you all are finding it hard to use the question and answer box, you can also use the chat. So I'm looking at the chat as well. Does anybody have any questions for Christine? We've about 5 minutes before we move on to Alice. I actually had a question. Oh, there you go. So Claudia is asking, why is red meat such a high risk?
Okay, thank you for your question. So there are a number of components of red meat that can actually contribute to risk, especially for colorectal cancer. And some of that has to do with how red meat is actually cooked. A lot of people who prepare red meat will cook it on the barbecue, will either cook it to the point where it has a lot of charred black pieces on it. And that is problematic because those charred black pieces are carcinogenic and they're called heterocyclic amines, and they can actually cause some of that DNA alteration and that DNA damage that I was showing earlier. Those contribute to those reactive oxygen species that sort of try to get at our DNA. And so that's probably one of the biggest risks associated with red meat consumption. The other thing is that red meat is highly saturated fat. And we know that saturated fat, when we talk about inflammation, is one of the key drivers of the formation of prostaglandins, which are something that we don't want to have an abundance of because those lead to the inflammatory response in our body. And any low-grade chronic inflammation that occurs over a long period of time is actually not beneficial for our cells or for our body, and it really is one of the etiologic or hypothesized etiologic factors of disease. And so we're really trying to eliminate a lot of the low-grade inflammation in our bodies. And if you think about omega-3 fatty acids, for example, that is actually an anti-inflammatory food that can actually lead us down a different pathway that is more anti-inflammatory, and that's what you want your diet to include more of. I don't know if that answers your question.
We have a couple of other questions. One is, there are a lot of nitrate-free natural hot dogs out there. Are they any safer?
If you're going to eat hot dogs and can choose the nitrate-free, that's better. But just overall, you want to avoid processed meats as much as you can. You can make healthier choices, within those red and processed meat categories, and I would encourage you to do so. But if you can avoid it altogether, it's even better.
Okay, good. And then just another related question, why are deli meats so bad? And shouldn't we distinguish red meat from processed meats when we're talking about how we limit them in our diet?
Yes, okay, so you can, and they have been in studies divided out, so you look specifically at red meat versus processed meat, because processing can involve smoking, which leads, you smoke the meat, which leads to the formation of these cancer-causing polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, and it also adds a lot of salt when you process. So that can also develop not only colorectal cancer, but also associated with stomach cancer. And then, like we were talking about earlier, the processing of meat includes the N-nitrosyl compounds, which you want to avoid altogether. And there are some cuts when we talk about red meat that can be healthy if they're prepared in a way that doesn't really char the meat, where you get those dark, crispy pieces. And if you choose grass-fed and more healthier forms of red meat, that can be part of a healthy diet. The point is that you just want to make sure that you are reducing your consumption as much as you can. Less than 18 ounces a week for most people is not a lot. A lot of people sit down to have a 10-ounce steak and don't think anything about it, and have that a couple times a week. So I think the most important thing is think about portion size. If you want to have some red meat, that can be part of a healthy diet, as long as you have a lot of the plant-based foods as the majority of your diet. And yes, when we talk about deli meats and red meat, we can separate those. If you can choose a healthier meat, like you said, those that don't have the nitrates, better. But again, you want to try and reduce those as much as possible.
Great, thank you so much, Christine. There's a question I'm going to answer, and as I'm answering that, Christine, if you could stop sharing your screen, then Alice will share hers. Somebody asked if we're going to have a copy of this information and slide set. Yes, I will be sending a copy of that in a follow-up email after we're done. So now I think we're going to move on to Alice, and I'll just let you take it away, Alice.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Momenti, and for that in-depth look at colorectal cancer research and the science behind foods that fight cancer. And I appreciate the opportunity to be able to share AICR's research tools and programs with you all today. So first of all, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the American Institute for Cancer Research, or AICR, and our global network. And then I want to delve into how we translate our research into cancer prevention recommendations and resources for the public and health professionals. So a little bit of history. In 1982, the American Institute for Cancer Research was founded to advance the simple, but at that time very radical idea that cancer could be prevented. AICR focused on the link between diet and cancer and began supporting cutting-edge research in this area and educating the public about the results. Today, we continue to fund research in the field of nutrition, physical activity, and cancer prevention, treatment, and survival. And the Colorectal Cancer Cup report is one of many cancer site-specific reports that are part of our third expert report. We also interpret the results of that research along with findings from all the global scientific community to craft our reliable, evidence-based recommendations for lower cancer risk. AICR is a member of the World Cancer Research Fund, or WCRF International, and our partners include WCRF in the UK and in the Netherlands. So AICR's recommendations for cancer prevention are based on the AICR WCRF Third Expert Report, which was a global systematic review of all the evidence on diet, weight, and physical activity and cancer risk. And that was released in last year in 2018. So these recommendations offer evidence-based guidance for educators and health professionals to help clients and patients take action for lower cancer risk. And evidence from independent studies continues to build to show that following these recommendations work. So just to go briefly through the recommendations, our first one, because it has the most impact on the greatest number of cancers, is to be a healthy weight, to keep your weight within a healthy range and avoid weight gain in adult life. Be physically active, to be active as part of everyday life, and importantly, to walk more and sit less. Eat a diet rich in whole grains, vegetables, fruits, and beans. So to make these foods a major part of your usual daily diet. And as we just discussed, to limit consumption of red and processed meat. And we talk about eating moderate amounts of red meat, such as beef, pork, and lamb, but to eat little, if any, processed meat. Limit consumption of sugar-sweetened drinks. So choose mostly water and try to choose unsweetened drinks. Limit consumption of fast foods and other processed foods that are high in fat, starches, and added sugars. So limiting these foods is really important in helping to control and maintain a healthy weight. Limit alcohol consumption, and actually for cancer prevention, we say it's best to not drink alcohol. Finally, don't use supplements for cancer prevention. There are reasons why people may need to take supplements, but for cancer prevention, aim to meet your nutritional needs through diet alone. And then we have 2 recommendations for special populations. For mothers, breastfeed your baby if you can, and if you're a survivor after a cancer diagnosis, follow our recommendations if you can. So for each of our general recommendation, there are some specifics on why this recommendation helps to reduce risk. This information also provides guidance on how the recommendation can be implemented. For example, the plant-based diet provides nutrients and phytochemicals that can protect cells from damage, and we know that eating this way also helps to maintain a healthy weight. AICR defines a plant-based diet as one with a plate that has at least 2/3 containing plant foods and 1/3 or less with animal foods. There are many recommendations that address risk factors for colorectal cancer, as you heard from all the various risk factors from Dr. Momenti's talk. So as you share the message with the public or work with individuals, think of the recommendations as a menu for supporting behaviors to improve health and to lower cancer risk. A realistic first step is just to encourage choosing one change. Help people identify support from their family and friends. Help them name specific steps for successful change and to establish ways to be accountable for putting these steps into action. So although we know that the more recommendations people follow, the greater the impact, the most important action is to take the first step. So start with a change that is realistic for you and create a SMART goal, one that is specific, measurable, actionable, realistic, and time-specific. And then help people find support and accountability, whether that's you as a healthcare provider, a friend, or a family member, for example. And that can be in person or electronically. So a good first step, a good starting point, is to focus, is to help people identify a starting point. And although our recommendations work together, choosing one step is important. So AICR's report on colorectal cancer shows some exposures that lend themselves to specific lifestyle targets. And here's a part of the matrix where you can see specific lifestyle actions that directly correspond to risk. For diet-related actions, the evidence shows that consuming whole grains and foods containing fiber links to lower risk. So based on that information, here's an example of a SMART goal that we use as one of our weekly challenges in our online 12-week program, the New American Plate Challenge. The challenge participants are encouraged here to aim for 3 servings of whole grains daily, which was the amount that research shows begins to help lower risk. For physical activity, because the matrix also shows that physical activity decreases risk for colorectal cancer, here's an activity goal from the New American Plate Challenge that helps participants think of small steps to become more active. Here we encourage a modest increase in daily steps to build up confidence as well as endurance. An exposure that is important yet not easy to address, having excess body fat is a risk not only for colorectal cancer, but for 11 other cancers. So we cannot ignore that. But focusing on weight or having that conversation about weight can be difficult, whether as a public health message or in a clinic setting. Some people might be grateful for some help and ideas for their weight, while others will not be ready. One positive approach is to start with the message that being in a healthy weight range is protective, but if you are not in that range, there are other steps you can take to lower cancer risk. And focusing on actions rather than on weight can be a much more productive approach for many people. We know that cancer is complex, with many factors contributing to the disease. So for the person who isn't ready to think about his or her weight, it's helpful to think of the recommendations as a menu from which to choose for actions. Whether boosting physical activity, cutting back on sugary drinks, or even eating just one vegetable, getting started with something can be empowering. Encourage your audience or your clients to focus on taking the best care of themselves that they can. Emphasize how taking even small steps can help you feel better, have more energy, be able to do more, and maybe even enjoy family and friends more. Whatever your role in promoting health, AICR has resources that can help. Our blog offers expert takes on cancer research in the news, explanations on hot topics, and other stories to help understand the world of cancer prevention. Our website is home to a variety of information, including print and e-publications and resources for the public and health professionals. You can access the entire Third Expert Report and all the continuous update reports from our research section. Some example of more resources on our website. These are resources for popular topics based on our recommendations. I want to point out the excellent articles in the Health Talk section of our nutrition advisor, Karen Collins, who is expert at helping people sort through the noise and get to the bottom line of diet choices, of healthy diet choices. And here you might want to bookmark this section if you have heard questions about cancer and soy, vegetarian diets, or supplements. Here we answer some of our most frequently asked questions. This Foods That Fight Cancer is a popular section of our website that discusses the current research on foods that have been studied for their cancer protective properties. Here we discuss the nutrition information of these foods and the research behind them. But it's important to note, as Dr. Momenti said, that the best protection is through consuming a variety of whole plant foods, because there's no one magic bullet, there's no one compound that will do the trick by itself. AICR brochures, fact sheets, and other educational materials can be accessed here at the AICR store. These brochures and handouts and pamphlets and printable fact sheets are great for health fairs. They're great for use in the clinics with individuals and as teaching tools for helping people make sense of the science of cancer prevention. Developed almost 20 years ago now, AICR's New American Plate shows how to implement a diet that helps lower cancer risk. The 2/3, 1/3 plate principle is based on the expert reports. By simply filling at least 2/3 of your plate with plant-based foods and 1/3 or less with animal foods, you are well on your way to a cancer-protective diet. From that model of a healthy diet and our exercise recommendations, AICR developed a program called the New American Plate Challenge, which is available online and it's free to anyone. It's designed to help individuals put our recommendations into action. The challenge is offered typically twice a year during the first few months of the calendar year and again during the fall season. We are just beginning week 5 now, and you can still sign up to take part in our current challenge. Just sign up at napchallenge.org. And while AICR focuses on our expertise of diet, weight, and physical activity, we know that patients, survivors, and their families also care about other spheres of life. These include emotional and spiritual health, areas that also need care and attention for our overall well-being. So AICR partnered with the iThrive program to reach survivors with this unique program. AICR's iThrive plan helps you construct a personalized wellness plan that will get you started and keep up with simple daily steps that become your new healthy habits. The program aligns to your strengths and helps to address areas that need more care and attention. The program provides an empowering environment for choices you can make that lead to positive stress management, rejuvenation, and addressing spiritual needs. AICR's iThrive plan complements our other resources like NAP Challenge that help you put the recommendations into practice. You can also sign up for our e-publications that keep you up to date, informed and motivated to keep a healthy lifestyle. And our research conference will be held in Chapel Hill, North Carolina this year from May 15th through 17th. Here's the program and a link to the registration, and I hope I will see some of you there. Finally, we hope you'll connect with us through social media, whatever your platform, via Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest, our blog, and we also have an Instagram account at Cancer Prevention. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alice. Just from my own personal experience with AICR, their resources are fantastic. And for any of you guys who are extension agents trying to get people to change their diet and always looking for recipes, they have a wonderful recipe site there. They produce a lot of videos. I have used a lot of their Facebook posts, etc., in my own campaigns via Facebook for our extension as well as the clients that we serve. So I really encourage you all to look at the resources there. Before we finish, we do have just a couple more questions that I'd like to get answered. One, going back to the processed meat issue, Mary Beth is asking, is there some good practical guidelines for processed meats when educating clients? Because how much should we be telling them to limit? Because some people like to have pepperoni on their pizza occasionally or bacon once a month or something like that. So do we have any kind of practical guidelines for occasional use of processed foods? Christy, I don't know if you want to jump in there, or Alice.
Well, I can tell you, when we talk about processed meat, we say save it for a special occasion. You know, if you're going out to the ballpark and you want to have a hot dog, or you have your special meat at a holiday time, that's great. I mean, the occasional use, is what we would say, sure, go ahead. It's just a consistent use. It's having processed meat. The more often you have it, the more that you would be at risk. So just trying to limit it, keeping it to, to special occasions.
And then one more question. Reza is asking, are there differences of this cancer rate between the United States and other countries with different dietary habits?
Christine, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So when we look at colorectal cancer globally, and I want to make sure I provide the correct answer. I could also, whoever's asked the question, I'd be happy to get back to you. But I think that's a great question because, as we know, when people migrate from different countries to another country and they adopt, say, the Western lifestyle, they increase their risk for whatever cancers are maybe associated with that lifestyle. And so when we look geographically around the world at colorectal cancer, I would have to get back to you to tell you exactly how that may differ by the different lifestyle and food habits of those particular cultures. I think that's a great question. But if Carlin, if you wouldn't mind, whoever asked it, I'd be happy to get back to you.
Most certainly, and if you'd like to, we can send that out when I send out the follow-up email as well, Christine.
Yeah, absolutely. Perfect.
Well, wonderful. I don't see any more questions coming across the chat box or the Q&A. So if I think that I just want to thank our panelists, and I want to thank AICR for facilitating this this event. I hope you all enjoyed and learned and can access their resources. And I also, if you can make it to their conference, that would be a wonderful thing as well. Again, you'll be receiving a follow-up email with the slides for the presentation, and hopefully in a couple of weeks, a link to this recording if you have others who'd like to be listening to this. So again, thank you so much, and we will end the webinar here. Thank you for your attendance. Let's see.